Welcome to the Right Take Podcast, news, ideas, and conversations at the intersection of politics and culture, a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I will be your host, Mark Tapson. Greetings, and welcome back to the Right Take Podcast. I am your host, Mark Tapson. Thanks to the Democrat weaponization of federal agencies such as the IRS and the FBI against the left's political enemies among American citizens, we have a whole new battleground dividing Americans known as lawfare, or legal warfare. It's actually not new, but we've seen such an extraordinary surge of it beginning under the administration of Barack Obama and then resumed and intensified under the Biden administration, most notably against the left's hated archenemy Donald Trump, that I think lawfare has become practically a household term now. It's certainly become one of the most prominent weapons in the left's arsenal as part of its strategy of the politics of personal destruction. There are lots of examples. I've written recently about the Marine vet Daniel Penny, for example, who was targeted with an outrageous manslaughter charge for rescuing his fellow New York City subway riders by restraining a dangerous mentally ill homeless man who later died, albeit not from Penny's restraint. Last week I had on my show for the second time the Navy veteran Michael Cassidy, whose case I have also written about, the fellow who tore down the demonic display that was erected at the Iowa State Capitol 2 Christmases ago by the local chapter of the Satanic Temple organization. Cassidy actually turned himself in to face a misdemeanor charge of property damage, but a George Soros-backed prosecutor decided to make an example of Cassidy by slapping him with a felony hate crime for knocking down a monument to Satan. Apparently hating Christians is okay, but hating Satan is a felony in our post-Christian culture. Arguably the most outrageous example is the hundreds and hundreds of protesters being persecuted for what the left ludicrously, hyperbolically, and falsely calls an insurrection on January 6, 2021. Today at The Right Take, I have a guest who can enlighten us about these instances of lawfare and more. I've been eager to have him on because he's a great guest, a smart, articulate military attorney that I have a lot of respect for. He actually represented Michael Cassidy in his defense and has gotten justice for military service members who were targeted for refusing to take the mandatory COVID vaccine. So please stay with us here at the intersection of politics and culture. You don't want to miss this interview. And don't forget to subscribe to The Right Take so you don't miss any of the other important conversations we're having here. And remember, if you like what you hear, please leave a review. Don't touch that dial. My guest today at the intersection of politics and culture is a military defense attorney based in Pennsylvania. He's a Christian homeschooling dad, so right away he's a man after my own heart. And a former military officer. He's a former prosecutor and JAG officer. He was the #1 ranked senior defense counsel in the Air Force. Davis Younts, welcome to the Right Take Podcast.
Thanks, brother. It's a pleasure to join you.
It's an honor to have you. Thanks for making the time. I was reading up on you at your website, yontslaw.com, and I have to say, I was pretty blown away by the successes and the accomplishments and honors that you have amassed in your career. I love that you were in law school when the 9/11 attacks went down and you enlisted right away to serve in the Air Force JAG Corps. Tell us a little bit about that, about your background and how you came to focus on the kind of legal work that you do and the clients that you represent.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, my father didn't serve in the military, but both of my grandfathers did. So one grandfather served in the Pacific Theater in World War II in the Navy, and then my other grandfather was in the Marine Corps during the Korean War. So there was instilled in me from a young age not only a Christian heritage, but also a very patriotic heritage and an understanding of what it takes to have an idea and a nation like America. So as I was going through school and everything else, I'd always thought about military service, but I also felt a very strong calling into the legal profession. And the stars never really aligned. It wasn't really in God's timing until I was in law school. And I'll never forget, I walked out of my first year of law school. I walked out of tax class, a tax law course. Very boring, to be honest. But I walked out, and I remember walking into the street outside of the law school building in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and seeing one of my classmates walk up, and she said, some idiot has just crashed a plane into the World Trade Center in New York. And at the time, my dad worked in New Jersey, so from his office, you could see parts of Manhattan. And I thought, well, that's crazy. But I was on my way to work. I had an internship in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, so I was just driving, and I started listening to the radio about 10 minutes into my short drive, and that's when I knew everything was happening, what was going on. And when I actually walked into the office, I was the first one to tell the other attorneys in that office what had happened. They didn't know. They were just working, right? They were just a normal work day. And then within a few minutes of arriving there, the second plane hit the second tower, and things went from there. But in that moment, as many people did, just based on the understanding I had, I was like, okay, we're at war. We've been attacked on our homeland. American people have died, and if there is an opportunity for me to serve and to give back, it's my time. So as soon as I finished law school, I already had been accepted into the Air Force JAG Corps, and so I left law school. And as soon as I passed the bar and got orders, I was on my way to becoming an Air Force officer and then a JAG.
I love also that you were a homeschooled and homeschooling dad and a devout Christian, and that the values of faith and family deeply inform the work that you do. Tell us how you view that responsibility and how it motivates you.
Yeah, absolutely. My parents moved to Pennsylvania when I was 8 years old, and homeschooling was not only not popular and not common, it was extremely difficult. The state of Pennsylvania was doing everything they could to make it very, very difficult. So my parents were involved early on with the Homeschool Legal Defense Association and others to kind of push back. So for me, it was very personal being homeschooled and doing those things. So once I got married and had the opportunity to have children, God's blessed us with two wonderful daughters. That became something my wife and I were very passionate about. After 11 years on active duty in the Air Force, we moved back to Pennsylvania, and it was just critical to me to be engaged and involved. So one of the first things I did was get involved with a group here in Pennsylvania and testify before the Pennsylvania State House, advocating for legislation that once again significantly improved the law here in Pennsylvania. So that kind of came full circle. So all of that is to say that's part of my passion for the law. But as a Christian, more importantly, I believe very, very strongly that we cannot have a just system. We can't have a just and free society without a biblical foundation. None of this works, right? Our founding fathers understood that. They were not simply deists or atheists or otherwise. They understood very clearly that our Constitution is founded on a biblical framework. And so that's the obligation and responsibility I take to the practice of law. And it's interesting. God changes us and works on us, dramatically. I always wanted to be a prosecutor, right? I thought that's the way that I would serve my country, serve God is, even in the military, I thought being a prosecutor, and I was a prosecutor. But as the military does, you don't always get to choose where you live or what you do. And so I became a defense counsel for the military at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And that was my chance to stay in the courtroom if I was going to do that. That's what I wanted to do. So I did it. And within about 6 months of being in a position like that, I started to realize all the tremendous opportunities it gave me as an attorney and as a Christian to just speak gospel truth into people's lives. And so, most people that need a defense attorney inside the military or outside the military, there are still sin issues involved, right? So there's fundamental problems, and they're dealing with consequences of sin in their life, regardless of whether what's happening to them is just or not. So that gave me a tremendous opportunity. And it's one of the things I pray for constantly is that God will bring clients to us, to our law firm, that we can share the gospel with, as well as try to impact their case and try to get the best possible just outcome for them.
Well, I've read a lot of the reviews of you and your firm from former clients, and to a person, it seems they find you honest and trustworthy and committed to justice and the truth. So congratulations, man. You are doing great work, and thank you for your service while I'm at it. Do military service members have to wrestle with issues and legal wrinkles that might be different from the average defendant outside the military, something the average outsider like myself might not be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it is one of those things, before I began to serve, I didn't really understand a lot of what's involved when we talk about legal issues within the military. So the first thing is just to recognize that the military is a microcosm of society, right? The military is not separate and apart in that you have any crime that you have happening in the rest of society, you can see within the military, and the same with other, social problems and concerns. So those issues are always present. But the biggest thing is the military justice system is designed and was originally intended to be designed to be a force multiplier. It's part of the command structure so that commanders can maintain good order and discipline. And another piece of it is it needs to be unique in jurisdiction because military members are deployed all over the world, stationed all over the world. So wherever a military member is in the world, they are still subject 24 hours a day to the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the military justice system. So those bring unique aspects to it. And I think that, one of the things that gets confused as well is people think, oh, you give up your rights, you give up your constitutional rights when you join the military. That's not true. There are aspects of free speech and other things that are limited, but it would be ironic that individuals who swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution would somehow give up their constitutional rights. So we don't. There's still due process in the military. You still have religious freedom. You have the basic guarantees of constitutional rights. There are some limitations occasionally due to mission requirements or other things. Obviously, you don't have a free speech right to share classified information. Things like that are obvious, but those constitutional rights are still there. So it's a unique and interesting system. It's a very powerful system, and I would say for the most part, it is a very fair and just system. It's just unique in jurisdiction as well as often the subject matter that we're dealing with in military courts martial.
And it has to feel very reassuring, I would imagine, to your clients that your own military experience gives you special insight into their concerns, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just blessed to have a really interesting, enjoyable military career, doing 11 years on active duty, deploying, being a prosecutor, being defense counsel. So I learned a lot. The last thing I did was I was the chief of the Military Justice Division at the Air Force JAG School. So in that position, I supervised the instructors and provided instruction myself for all new JAGs, all continuing education for JAGs, so Air Force lawyers, but also paralegals as well. So there is a lot of unique experience and training that I have to bring for my clients, but it is I think what's really reassuring to them as well is just understanding that I did 20 years total after active duty. I joined the reserve, so I retired as a lieutenant colonel. So there is a shared experience with military members that I can bring. Most of my clients have deployed. I deployed, and just the military education process and all those things I think are a significant part of it. And I do think both for myself and for my law partner, our military experiences are what enable us to be successful in advocating for many of our clients.
Could you give us an example or two of cases that you've taken on for military or ex-military clients who have faced outrageous legal injustices? I have to assume, for example, that you've had to do some work on behalf of service members who were forced out of the military for refusing the COVID vaccine.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of examples that I could give. As you could imagine, I think some of the COVID examples are instructive beyond just each individual case. The COVID was a real challenge for our country, and it was uniquely challenging to the military just because two aspects for military members. One was a question of the religious freedom of military members. Can, a military member have a valid religious objection to a medical treatment, and can they still perform the mission? Can the military still survive if they grant a religious accommodation like that? And then the other piece was the law. Many people don't realize there is statutory guidance that says the military cannot force a service member to take an emergency use or experimental product unless it's been approved by the FDA. So one of the things that we saw in the military is the FDA approved COVID products, COVID vaccine products for use on the public and for use in the military, but there were none of the approved formulas for the vaccines were actually made available to military members, right? So that sounds crazy, but precisely what happened was the drug manufacturers produced all of these emergency use authorization, these EUA formula products, and then the FDA approved a different formula, and the U.S. government had already purchased, millions and millions of doses of these non-FDA approved emergency use formulas. And so military members, we would go and we would literally walk into clinics on military bases, and the vials, the bottles of the vaccine that were present would have labeled on them emergency use authorization only, right? So one of the individuals I represented was a military member, a Navy lieutenant, outstanding career, a lot of high success, and he simply looked at the law, understood it, and said, until the Navy can make available to me an FDA-approved product, and I can verify that, I'm not going to follow this because I don't believe it's a lawful order. Everyone thought he was crazy. He got in contact with me. I was able to represent him at a board where they were trying to separate him adversely from the United States Navy, and the three Navy officers, senior Navy officers in that board, looked at the evidence we presented and understood what we presented, and they said, yeah, I am not convinced this was a lawful order, so we're going to find no misconduct as it pertains to this order to receive the vaccine, and they retained my client at that board. So that was one of the most stunning and interesting examples, but there were so many during COVID. I represented almost 100 clients at any one given time. There were one of the groups was a group of 20 plus Navy SEALs who that's a crazy story in and of itself, and it's how God works miraculously. But I got a phone call at almost midnight on a Tuesday night from a friend, a fellow attorney, who is he's a homeschool advocate. He runs an organization called Heritage Defense. And we had met at a homeschool conference, right? We both took our families to a homeschool conference. We had met and talked. But he called me at 11:45 on a Tuesday night. I'll never forget it. And he said, Davis, I've got a group of maybe 60 Navy SEALs that are being told if they don't get the vaccine tomorrow, they're going to be court-martialed and thrown in the brig. I didn't know who else to call. Can I call, can you help? Is there anything you could do to help these guys? And I said, of course, let me jump in. Let me do whatever I can to try and help. And so that's what I did. So by that Friday, I was in a room with over 60 Navy SEALs, a couple of pastors, that other attorney, and we came up with a game plan to sort of push back and do what we could to buy them time. But it was fascinating to see, in my opinion, the best of the best, highly trained, highly experienced. I mean, some of the guys in this room are famous Navy SEALs, 30 years of experience, multiple deployments. They put everything on the line multiple times. I mean, there wasn't anyone in that room that hadn't lost someone in an operation, someone close to them in an operation. And they were desperate for help. They were strong Christian men. They just wanted to do the right thing and honor God, but they were convinced this was not a lawful order, and no one was listening, right? And that was one of the biggest problems we had during COVID is the Department of Defense under the previous administration just simply didn't care what the law said. And I say that not idly. One of the things that happened during COVID, I wasn't a direct attorney on the case, but I had clients that were part of it, was there was an injunction that was finally issued to stop the enforcement of the COVID vaccine for the Air Force. And when the Department of Defense appealed that, the attorney representing the Department of Defense admitted in a federal appeals court on the record to a federal appeals judge, admitted that their position was the Department of Defense, the Air Force in that case, did not have to follow or comply with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a federal statute. They didn't have to comply with it. It didn't apply with them. And the only time they would have to comply with it is if a service member thought they violated it, sued in federal court, and a federal judge told them and ordered the Air Force to comply with a federal statute that was in existence. That's on the record in that federal case. And so a lot of people were blown away by that. But I think COVID was an example of what happens when we put, crisis in front of Constitution and we start to ignore basic fundamental principles. And that certainly happened to the United States military. So, the COVID cases, there's many other examples I could give. One of the interesting things that happened, it's very unique to the military. There's something in the military called non-judicial punishment. And you'll often hear it referred to as Article 15, which refers to Article 15 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You might have seen it in a movie as referred to Navy, they would call it Captain's Mast. But it's this process, it's this non-criminal, non-judicial process. But because of the punishment you can receive from it, you can turn it down and you can say, no, I want to be tried by a court-martial. In other words, I know you're not charging me with a crime now, but I'm either so adamant that I need that due process, or I'm so confident in my case that I'm going to turn this down and ask for court-martial. And so I had a Air Force NCO do that. He was offered an Article 15. A bunch of other lower-ranking people had been given Article 15, so they were being fined money. They were being reduced in rank and kicked out under adverse circumstances from the Air Force in violation of their religious freedom rights under COVID. And I had an Air Force Master Sergeant, and we turned down the Article 15, and we said, no, he's not going to accept that. We want a court-martial. He was willing to go to court. That means he was willing to go to jail over his stand. And when we did that, the Air Force backed down, indicating a couple of things. One, they were afraid. They didn't understand the consequences. But the other piece was they were going to have to prove this was a lawful order in a military court in front of a military judge to a military jury. And I do think they were afraid of the precedent it would set if we were successful in that case. So there's a lot you can learn from that. I think we can learn from that as Christians and just as advocates in our lives, the importance of coming together, because those Navy SEALs taking a stand the way they did, being willing to have pastors and others like myself go public on their behalf, created a rallying point for so many other people in the military to come together and push back. And that did a couple of things. It brought people's attention to it. It brought other lawyers into the fight, but it also bought time for us to come up with a game plan and get injunctions in federal court and other things. But the COVID cases are a wild example of some of the things that good people, good Christians have been able to come together and do to fight for freedom.
Is it your sense over the course of your career in the military, is it your sense that the military has become more politicized lately? Like, I'm thinking of the COVID situation and the whole DEI initiatives that have filtered through the military. Is it your sense somehow that the military is becoming more politicized and more difficult for service members to sort of navigate those waters?
Short answer is yes. And then, I can certainly try and give some examples of that from my own career. But, there's always this difficult balance with our military, because the military works for, the civilian political leadership, works for the American people, but also has this high calling of supporting and defending the Constitution, right? So there's this interesting balance of what does that look like for service members. So what I've seen over my career has been different administrations have made greater efforts to politicize the military or not. There's always been a tendency, a desire by some political leaders, by some presidents, to use the military as, in some ways, a means of social experimentation. In other words, sort of bring about change, societal change, through the military. And sometimes I think there's been some positive aspects of that. When you had go back to World War II and look at the civil rights concerns you had and just sort of the segregation that was present even within the military. But when bullets started flying and things needed to get done, those kinds of concerns fade away quickly. And it doesn't matter what the political agenda is of certain leaders. People are going to come together and do the job, and they're not going to care. Military members aren't going to care. So as a group, as a microcosm of society, it's not that the military is perfect and that there isn't racism, but you have seen for decades just tremendous diversity, wonderful diversity, and just wonderful cohesiveness. But I would say that did start to change. I think during the Obama administration, there was divisiveness I had never seen. There was sort of hyper divisiveness. There was a tendency of individuals to weaponize military systems to their advantage. So, there's this extreme tendency to, I would say, believe the victim. And what I mean by that is if someone claims something happened to them, whether it's sexual assault or sexual harassment or discrimination of some kind, the default position became, well, we believe the person that's making a complaint no matter what, and we're going to treat it as if it is true, and we're going to ignore due process. We're going to ignore the presumption of innocence. And if you're accused of something like that, certain kinds of things, there is no it becomes very, very difficult to get any fair process. So that was kind of the first stage of the politicization that I saw. And then before COVID hit, we began to see, just all of these DEI initiatives came in. They came in very, very rapidly with the Biden administration, and it really did reach a point where it became unrecognizable for me. So I was a reservist, an Air Force reservist at the time, and I remember sitting in anti-extremism training right after January 6th events occurred. I remember sitting in anti-extremism training on an Air Force base and being told, given definitions of extremism, and being told things like, well, someone is an extremist if they are willing to give their life and sacrifice their life in support of an idea. That's an indication of a dangerous extremist. Now just think about that. I'm sitting on an Air Force base in uniform, looking around at everyone else sitting in this auditorium in uniform, going, we all swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, to give our lives to do that if necessary. And so there was just this wild disconnect between progressive, woke, even Marxist ideology, coming into the military, becoming very divisive within the military, and just this disconnect from the reality of what it means to serve in the military. And so, it just became rapidly worse. You have the military, a military that is paying, upwards of $500,000 for people to have gender transition surgeries in the military. And that's taxpayer money using military funds to pay for those procedures, when it makes someone truly incapable of being physically fit, incapable of properly deploying because they have to be on those medications. And so now you have a military member that can't deploy, that's costing the taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars, and may in fact be suffering from, significant mental health issues. And, tell me that's not political, because it's certainly not connected to good order and discipline or the mission. So I would say that's the biggest thing that I have seen just sort of across the board, is this move towards military justice processes and other things. If it's certain kinds of things, the same kind of things that might get someone canceled outside of the military, right? There's just an assumption of guilt that makes it very difficult for people. And then you have just the use during the Biden administration of the military to try to infect Marxist ideology, really truly progressive ideology, into the military, critical race theory and otherwise. And that's become very political.
Well, there's been a lot of lawfare going on lately. I want to get to the January 6th, the whole January 6th issue in just a moment, but I want to ask you about the Daniel Penny case, because this is one of the controversial cases in the news, about which I'm sure you know about, the Marine veteran who stepped in to prevent possible violence on a New York City subway. He put a ranting drug addict in a chokehold, and subsequently that person, who was black, died, and Penny, who is white, went on trial for murder or manslaughter. He was acquitted, thank God, and I think most Americans, certainly not the media elites, but most Americans, I think, saw him as a hero being targeted for political reasons rather than a racist murderer. What's your take on the Penny case and its outcome?
I think that the Penny case was really unfortunate, and I think we're still just going to have to deal with society of the consequences of it for a couple of reasons. But there's a lot of takeaways. First of all, I'm not sure he would have been found not guilty if it were not for people recording what had occurred. And that's a sad and scary thing to say, that someone like him, a Marine veteran in New York, may not have been able to achieve a just or fair outcome if there was not video evidence of a few things. One, that he was protecting African-American passengers on the subway. And so he, there's no indication he was in any way racially motivated, and that didn't fit the narrative. So I think that's a huge part of it. So I think it's just interesting to note, as a practitioner, as an attorney, the importance of having that video evidence there is fascinating. But I think the really dangerous, unfortunate part of the Daniel Penny case that we have to learn from as a nation is the authority and discretion that prosecutors have. And so you have, Alvin Bragg in New York, who is a Soros-funded and elected prosecutor, who has tremendous discretion. And in a case like someone like Daniel Penny and so many other cases of lawfare, the process itself is a form of punishment. And what I mean by that is look at pictures of Daniel Penny before he was charged with a crime and after his trial. The guy lost a lot of weight. You can just see the stress and just the pain that he was going through, because this is something that can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to properly defend in court, and most of the American people have no access to resources like that to do it. So the process itself can bankrupt you, it can ruin job prospects, it can just have such a negative effect, even if you go to trial and you have the opportunity to be successful. But the lasting damage is, who wants to be the one to intervene in a public setting in these cases? So, going after and prosecuting someone who was acting in defense of himself and defense of others, doing something reasonable, clearly not intended to cause permanent injury or death. I mean, he was using a hold that is taught in jiu-jitsu. It's taught to be non-lethal. That's the point of it. It's to subdue someone without breaking bones or harming them. And it's something he would have learned as a Marine in combatives as a non-lethal thing. This is something he would have done, perhaps hundreds of times to other fellow Marines until they tap or submit to what he's doing. And that's anyone that's ever taken jiu-jitsu or participated in that understands that. So he wasn't, he didn't pull a knife, he didn't pull a gun, he wasn't just kicking or punching the guy. He was trying to do a non-lethal, something that would not cause permanent harm, and yet he was charged. So the next person may not be willing to step in. And it's the same kind of effect. It has the same kind of effect on citizens, because American people used to criticize people, who stood by and didn't intervene in crimes in New York. People crying for help and no one steps in and intervene. And now every reasonable person is going to be thinking in the back of their mind, especially in New York, am I going to be criminally prosecuted? Am I going to go to jail because a Soros-funded prosecutor is going to question my race, my motivations, my intentions, or what I did to try and help others? The same thing, we see police officers get killed because they hesitate to take action because they're afraid of prosecution, because of things that have nothing to do with their assessment of the situation, but fears of being deemed racist or otherwise. So, yeah, the Penny case, praise God, he was acquitted ultimately, but we have a lot to learn, and a huge takeaway, and not to go off on a rant on this on you, but the takeaway for this that I would encourage everyone to think about that hears this is, do you know who the prosecutor is in your local jurisdiction? Do you know who the prosecutor is in your county? Who is your district attorney? And I'll submit to you, Barack Obama and George Soros realized over a decade ago the impact they could have on social change by spending a couple $100,000 on a district attorney's race, even in a rural county or somewhere else, the tremendous societal impact that could have and how much it matters. They realized it. I think others have not. And I would just say, if you're hearing this, find out who your district attorney is. Find out if they were elected because they received a couple $100,000 in donations from a Soros-funded PAC, and ask yourself why. Because during COVID, sheriffs and local prosecutors had a huge impact on policy. But we see how these things play out in the Daniel Penny case. I mean, another example of that is the Christian Navy Reserve officer Michael Cassidy that I represented in Iowa. He was the one that took down the Satan statue in the Iowa State Capitol. And when the Soros-funded prosecutor in Iowa, conservative rural Iowa, but when the Soros-funded elected prosecutor there got a hold of the case, she tried to turn it into a precedent-setting hate crime and turn it into a felony. So again, I think that ties into the Penny case, and we have to understand these district attorneys. They're locally elected. It's usually only a couple thousand votes that could make a tremendous difference in those elections, and yet most people don't know who their district attorneys are.
That's very good advice. I hadn't thought about that myself. I know Michael Cassidy pretty well. I actually had him on the podcast literally just last week, and I wrote an article about it at the time that his case came to light. I had him on the podcast at that time, too, a little over a year ago. Speaking of being made an example of, we just passed the 4th anniversary of what the Democrats are fond of calling one of the worst moments in American history, right up there with Pearl Harbor and the Holocaust and 9/11, the so-called January 6th or J6 insurrection in D.C. It's hard to listen to the details and the stories of these hundreds and hundreds of Trump supporters who have been politically persecuted, literally, in ways that seem indistinguishable to me from treatment under a totalitarian state, especially considering that we now know what many of us suspected from the beginning, which is that this so-called insurrection was instigated by FBI plants and facilitated by Capitol Police, who literally funneled many of the peaceful protesters into the Capitol. Many Americans are hopeful that the incoming Trump administration will commute most, if not all, of the sentences of those who've been convicted. But what is your legal perspective on the intensity and the ruthlessness with which the state has pursued the prosecution of these protesters and their unconstitutional treatment?
It is hard to come up with or comprehend an example in American history where you have over 1,500 people charged, over 1,100 people convicted of, at worst, if you give the government the benefit of the doubt, with rare exceptions, trespassing. Right? Some sort of trespassing type offense, right? So, they want to call it interfering with an official proceeding or otherwise, but the reality is that's what it is. Think of it as, you're in the wrong place. You're not authorized to be there at that moment in time, and you've done that. So there's a lot of things we can see about these cases, and they justify why I say it was unprecedented. First is just the treatment of the individuals awaiting trial. So set aside for a moment just the question of whether or not, wise discretion was used in deciding who to charge or not. There are people, I've talked to some of them, I'm certainly aware firsthand of cases, as you are, where people with no criminal history, peaceful people, no criminal history at all, are swatted by the FBI without warning in their homes, not all of them, but many, in a dangerous situation, treated worse than drug dealers. I mean, I have volunteered and been a part of, indigent defense for federal cases here in Pennsylvania, and I've represented, known drug dealers and other things. And when they're being arrested, I get a call from the FBI agent and from the assistant U.S. attorney that's like, hey, does your client mind coming in on Thursday to turn themselves in? A known drug dealer with a violent, with like drug crimes in the past. And I'm like, yes, we'll be there, And yet, these January 6th defendants were not given that. I mean, even, known ones, actors and things like that were, ambushed at the airport, arrested without warning at the airport, arrested in their homes. So we've seen that with them. A high number of them have been subjected to pretrial confinement, meaning they're sitting in jail for years, right? Awaiting trial, being punished if they didn't immediately plead guilty to whatever it is the prosecutors wanted them to plead guilty to. And then the treatment they've received in those facilities has been just highly unusual from the cases I'm aware of, a lot of solitary confinement and other things. So why, nonviolent offenders with no past criminal history, what is the possible justification for treating them that way and treating them so differently than others in the system, treating them differently than people I have represented who have committed far worse offenses with a far worse criminal history, and they're not being given any benefit of the doubt. And so it does appear to be politically motivated, ideologically driven, and it does feel like political prosecution. And you don't have to have positive feelings about anything that happened on January 6th. You don't even have to be pro-Trump in any way to be able to recognize how poorly these people have been treated, how unnecessary it's been. And the worst part, and I represented some federal law enforcement agents who, whistleblowers and other things that just, wanted the world to know or understand, like, there have been people who were reprimanded in the FBI because they wouldn't SWAT someone. They wouldn't engage in that raid, and they're told, well, then you're not on this case anymore. We need to find someone else who will engage in a raid because that's how we want to do this. They're like, one FBI agent called me and like, I had just been talking to this person. I just had a great, polite, lovely conversation with them. And I know they'll turn themselves in. This isn't an issue. There's a lot I could say about that, but I am praying that the president will use his authority to pardon and commute as many sentences as possible, and that they have a very clear system in place to do that well. But it is hard to describe the inequality that they've been treated with, just as well as just the vast majority were nonviolent. Many, I just firmly believe many didn't realize they were doing anything remotely wrong initially, and there are countless stories of that. A door being held open for them, so they walk through the Capitol, get uncomfortable, walk out, and now they're being charged with a federal crime.
Yes, it's outrageous. It'll be interesting to see what the Trump administration does, and I hope that they seek justice for all of those protesters. Speaking of pardons, let me talk now or ask you now about the pardons that Joe Biden seems to be handing out like Halloween candy as he wraps up his term in office. A lot of Americans believe that he has far and above abused this presidential privilege and that he's not seeking to correct injustices, but is simply just handing them out for political and personal reasons. What do you think about that? And what should be the philosophy that underlines this whole pardoning process? What are the proper limits to presidential pardons?
Yeah, so great questions. First of all, I would say just by the numbers alone, Joe Biden is going to set the record for the sheer number of pardons and commuted sentences. So I think that's one part of it, just to look at statistically, it's way out of balance with the norm. Barack Obama was a high number as well, but Biden is he's going to set a record I don't think will ever be broken in that regard. So then the other question really is a fundamental question of what is the intent and the purpose of the presidential power to pardon. In the Constitution, it's a very few lines, right? It's a very small phrase in the Constitution that provides this. So we do have to look in some respects to like English common law and just sort of understand what the founders were thinking. I do think there are some biblical principles behind it, but typically a pardon, if we're talking a true pardoning for a crime, is for someone who either was unjustly, right, truly unjustly convicted, should not have been convicted and punished, and it's clear, or it's a situation where they have there has been a level of repentance and change such that it is now just and reasonable and warranted to pardon that person, and there are different ways to look at it, but those are really the strictures that I would look at and that I would advise people to be thinking about. And certainly the cases I would be interested in is obviously someone unjustly, improperly, wrongly convicted. Yes, a pardon is appropriate. That's a way for the president to pursue justice. But every other aspect of the pardon should be funneled through, is this something that is protecting the innocent and punishing the wicked? And so if it's a scenario where someone is not repentant, has not remorseful, has not paid for their crime, I think you have a hard time justifying exercising that. And I think there are numerous examples with President Biden, to include his own son, and sort of the broad blanket pardon, very unusual pardon that was given to his son. So it's rare in American history to give that kind of blanket, decades-long pardon like he did for his son.
Very interesting. Davis, we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's more we could go into. I'm going to have you back on, maybe once Trump is in office and we see how he handles the J6 protesters. How can people best keep track of the good work that you're doing? Are you a social media guy, or should people go to your website? What can they do?
Yeah, you can follow me, Davis Younts, on X. That's probably where we're the most active, and certainly my website, Younts Law. But Davis Younts on X, Younts Law also, just Younts Law, all one word, has an account on X as well. That's a great place to follow us. And I would just encourage everybody to be in prayer, to be thinking through how we pray well for the next administration, and just continue to pray that the right people are in place, the right people are put in position to bring America where it needs to be and humble us before God.
And make America great again.
Amen.
Davis Younts, thanks for joining us today at the Right Take Podcast, and thanks for taking a stand in defense of our military and of God and country.
Thanks, brother. I enjoyed it.
We'll keep up the good work. Listeners, don't forget to subscribe to The Right Take so that you don't miss any of the important conversations we're having here. And remember, if you like what you hear, please leave that positive review. See you next time. The Right Take with Mark Tapson is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.